Welcome to today's forum, which is hosted by EXTRA, a task force on existential threats and risks to all, under the auspices of the World Academy of Arts and Science, or WAS for short. I'm Professor Thomas Reuter, the chair of EXTRA and also a trustee of WAS. Now, EXTRA is a one-stop info hub for decision makers who need to understand the most pressing issues confronting humanity today. We have set ourselves the task to curate materials from leading organizations across the globe to create an up-to-date, concise and comprehensive overview of major existential threats and risks, thus enabling the strategic foresight needed to create pathways towards human security and well-being for all. We are also a forum for discussion for the major organizations operating in and publications being released in the area of X-risk research and reporting. Now, in the broadest terms, the theme for today's forum is to reflect on the importance of multilateralism in dealing with existential risks, which is also the theme of the next issue of the EXTRA newsletter, which will be published soon. Global cooperation can be regarded as a risk mitigating factor. In the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and I quote, "Our future depends on global cooperation to address global risks. The inaugural Global Risk Report sends a clear and urgent message. No country, company, or institution can confront these global vulnerabilities alone." Now, the Secretary General is not alone in saying this. Just today, there was a news report on a survey conducted by the Rockefeller Foundation of more than 36,000 people in 34 countries. And the results showed that the overwhelming majority of the world's people, 75%, demand more global multilateral cooperation on key challenges. At the same time, though, many also doubt that current institutions are effective. Indeed, many leading commentators speak of a crisis of diplomacy or a lack of multilateralism in view of the major frozen conflicts we witness today and in the wake of rising nationalist populism, particularly in the US. We know about the withdrawal of the US from a number of multilateral institutions. That's why it is very important for us who take an interest in existential risks to reflect on the symbolic and practical value of the UN Global Risk Report as probably the primary example of multilateralism in this area. Organized by the Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit of the Executive Office of the Secretary General and marking the entry of the UN into the sphere of integrated risk assessment, the report represents a comprehensive analysis of 28 global risks identified and assessed through a robust survey of 83 UN member states and over 1,100 stakeholders from across 136 countries. We now would like to consider in some detail the report's methodology, scope, its impact and likely future development, and also its foresight scenarios of 4 possible future states, which are called breakdown, status quo, progress, and breakthrough. In order to do so, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight, who all have very important insights to share. So let me introduce, first of all, Associate Professor Jonathan Moyer, who is the director of the Pardee Institute for International Futures at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies, University of Denver. And our second speaker is Dr. Ajay Gambhir from ASRA, which stands for Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, and he's a director and a lead on assessing interconnected systemic risks and crises. Then The next speaker will be Dr. Michael Marion, who's the research director of EXTRA and a fellow of the World Academy, and also the author of the Security and Sustainability Guide. And finally, we'll have Professor Stephen Hartman, who's the founding executive director of the BRIDGES Sustainability Science Coalition in the UNESCO MOST program. That means Management of Social Transformations. And he's based at Arizona State University's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Lab, and also at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. Okay, so let me first of all begin by inviting Jonathan Moyer to say a few things about the Pardee Institute and its work, and how you became involved in the making of this UN report. Jonathan, over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I plan to speak for about 15 minutes to give a sense of what Pardee is doing in this space and how our work contributed to the report. I certainly don't speak on behalf of any UN organization about this, so just an important caveat there. You should see a slide right now that says international futures. Do you see that? Can anyone nod their head? Yeah, okay. What I'm going to do is a very kind of brief overview of what the tool is. So the International Futures Model is the core of what we do. I don't come to this work from the perspective of risk. That's not my academic background. My academic background is in the social sciences and doing integrated assessment modeling, so large-scale, long-term quantitative modeling. And that's what this International Futures tool is focused on. The tool was applied in this UN report space, and I'll be showing you things that we did in the background of this work, stuff that's not included in the report itself, to give you a perspective on it's more of a methodology question. And then I'll go through some of the results that we presented to the UN. So the IFS tool. So I'm Jonathan. I direct this institute. We have about 15 full-time staff that work at the institute, and we work with anywhere between 60 and 100 graduate students every year, doing data work, modeling, analysis, that kind of stuff. We're a soft money funded institute, so we're constantly working with external groups to do contracts, grants, and other kinds of sponsored research activities. And in terms of size, we do about 2 million a year in that space. The IFS tool, you see a visualization here. On the left, these are the big, broad issue areas we cover. They may be hard to read, so I'll just describe them. The economy is really essential to what we're doing in this tool. The economy and demographics are really core modules that we focus a lot of our effort on. We have real strengths in human development systems, representations of education, governance, health-related systems, infrastructure. Those are the core unique areas where we do work. We also have representations that are more traditional in the integrated assessment modeling space, things like agriculture, energy, and the like. So this is the website that I used to make a screenshot of the image, and I'll just put a link there in case you're curious. What this does is this website tracks the interconnection between variables in the system. So if you're interested in something like government spending has a relationship with a whole range of indicators and variables in the system. Over here in the infrastructure module, over here in the economic module, down here in the international relations module, governance, health, education, for example. So the tool is really broadly interconnected across issue areas and systems. And this resource, the one I just put a link in the chat about, gives you a sense of the structure of that tool and how it works. I also want to share a link to the tool itself. This is the tool, the online version of the tool. You can use it for free. We're academic. We're trying to make things open access, open source. We're not a for-profit kind of group working in this space. So that's a real quick kind of high-level overview of what the tool is doing in terms of the interconnections and the systems that are represented. Happy to talk about that in any depth you'd like. For this work, four scenarios were created. These will have slightly different names from the ones that are in the actual UN risk report, but basically a continuation of development, which is an uneven world, some chaos, but some continued development, a disarray world. So this is the kind of collapse scenario, the where things go badly world. There's a growth and progress, like how do we continue moving along beyond the continuation and do something a bit better, and then a transformation, which would be the positive development trajectory. So for each of these, the way the UN risk report worked was there were surveys sent to a large number of stakeholders globally, and those surveys asked people to rank a set of risks that were predetermined following a steep framework. So society, technology, economics, environment, and politics. And so people ranked those risks across civil society, government, etc., globally. And then they ranked a set of solution spaces. They talked about the timing, things like this. That went into a process. And that's the majority of the report. That's the vast majority are these. What are risk perceptions doing globally back when the survey was taken in 2024? Then where we came in was UN Futures created narratives related to those risks about different worlds, and we operationalized them in the model. What operationalizing them in the model does is it allows you to take a foresight methodology that's very qualitative, very narrative based, very creative, and then apply that to a structure that's a lot more rigid, that has a lot more deep interconnectedness in terms of empirics and connection to an academic literature space. So what that does is it allows the qualitative narrative to be refined, right? So people can't factor all of the pieces that go into how the world is changing over a 50-year period. Some of these transformations are more durable. Demographic trends are very durable, right? Lots of stock flow understanding. Stocks are durable. So how do we think about embedding narratives that have to do with collapse in a framework that also is trying to do a systematic job of accounting for development? So what our work did was it refined the way the UN was describing and writing about those foresight scenarios. What I'm going to do now is show you some of the results and talk a bit about the complexity of doing this. Uh, this is one of the big issues when you think about operationalizing a scenario that looks at existential risk is how do you represent how bad things should be and what's the logic behind that? So one way is thinking about general benchmarking and thinking about the parameter interventions related to the scenario. So I'm showing you a table that comes out. None of the things I'm showing you are going to be in the UN report, but these are all things that kind of were in the background and helped inform the process. So what we do in the report is create parameter interventions in the model. So we take the different categories. You should see a Word document. I assume you can see something like that. Um, can you see that, or do you just see a PowerPoint for anyone? Uh, to-
We can just see it. We can see a table
yeah,
in
that's great.
what I think is
Thank you.
still PowerPoint, but yeah.
It's actually a Word document, but thank you, Ajay. That's exactly what I needed to hear. So these are parameter interventions for the table for the different scenarios. So what you're doing is you're intervening in this multidimensional space at different nodes in this network diagram using parameters that are operationalized in different ways that are informed by the actual foresight narrative. So the connection of the parameter magnitude to the narrative is not something that has, I think, a clear scientific basis and has a lot of subjectivity baked into it. So that's one thing that we have to begin thinking about. We're making a lot of assumptions on the narrative front end. That then drives a lot of these kind of results where we're thinking about how has history unfolded for average growth rates across these different issue areas, and then what do our scenarios say? So if we're in a disarray world, does global growth of 0.9% over time make sense? This is the kind of beginning framing, the assumption space that we're trying to work on. Moving forward to the results, I'm going to show you a series of graphs from different issue areas that are very high level kinds of results. So bubble size here, the pie graph size is the total number of people. So this is deaths, what we're looking at. So total number of deaths across time. First of all, in a transformation and a disarray world, so the two pie graphs on the right, 2050, this is what global mortality should look like from our model's perspective. You see more deaths in any scenario. There are more people, there's more aging, things like this. So some of these durable transformations, like that's the utility of using a quantitative tool like this to frame a qualitative foresight exercise. You put a little more empirics in the background. So 1990 to 2024, you see this kind of a shift towards more non-communicable deaths, which we expect to continue irrespective of the kind of crisis scenario. This is something you could certainly disagree with, that we're thinking about a disarray world that's too optimistic in this space. So that's one kind of conversation space, the health demographics. The poverty, moving forward to another result. This is looking at poverty historically from 1980 until 2050 across the four scenarios, four different regions. So your light green here is going to be East and Southeast Asia. So the development in China, you really see it reflected here. And then what you see in a growth and prosperity world is some optimism about that, but really the transformation world is where your poverty trend lines go closer to zero by mid-century. In a disarray world, in this world where we're trying to reflect the risks that are articulated in this report, you see increases in the absolute number of poverty through mid-century. But again, to contextualize this, if you look at 1980, global population was around, what, 5 billion? By 2050, in a bad scenario, global population will be north of 10 billion. So we're talking about doubled global population in this period. And what we're imagining in this world, or what we're modeling, is not a world where the global poverty number increases beyond what it was in 1980 even. And as a share of global population, it's much lower. Energy systems, the part of this whole narrative that are really essential. If you look at the total size of these pie charts, that represents global energy production across all types. And then your colors are black is for fossil, your carbon, your oil, gas, coal, yellow is nuclear, and green is renewable. So from 1990 to 2024, we do see a transformation in energy systems, but it's not of the scale that's needed in order to mitigate the worst climate effects. In these development scenarios, you still see more renewable energy in this global disarray scenario. You see more energy consumption overall in this really bad scenario. In the transformation scenario, you see less overall consumption. Actually, energy consumption, the way we modeled it, was similar to on a global basis to energy consumption today, though the dramatic transformation in the composition of energy, right? So I mean, this is trying to put some more of the durability of long-term trends on this foresight exercise. Next, the economy. The 1965 space, so the total pie chart size is the global economic production consumption in that year. Moving forward to today, there's a huge shift from a blue-dominated world, which is Europe and North America, to one where it's the global North and the global South on aggregate have similar overall economic productions, not per capita by a long shot, but similar mass overall. When you look at the transformation versus disarray, in our disarray world, the total economic production in 2050 is similar to what we have today. It hasn't collapsed in the sense of gone away or gone to zero. Obviously, on a per capita basis, it's much worse as well. So these are some of the economic results that were.
That's actually, if I may interject there for a moment,
Oh, yeah.
Jonathan, that's really quite remarkable. What you're showing there is that the economy will be half the size in a disarray world compared to a transformation world.
Yes, yes. No, I mean, there's a huge negative, the degree to which GDP connects to government spending and well-being. We all know that that connection is messy. But yes, the disarray world would be very negative, but not collapse negative. So this is the thing I'm really struggling with. I think the subtext to just articulate it is, how do you think about operationalizing a collapse world, and what should we think that world looks like? Like, because the narrative out there is, I think, collapse, like everyone goes away, things are dead, which doesn't show up in models that represent stock flow dynamics related to human development in that kind of way. So that's the thing I'm curious to discuss as well. A couple other small pieces. My time is almost up. We do things related to like education spending, spending on development. I'm showing you a slice of all the results, and you can see that there's great inequality moving forward across, even in this transformation scenario. The green line here, Europe and North America are spending a ton on education, while Sub-Saharan Africa is much lower. And at that time, Sub-Saharan African population is well over 2 billion, right? So these are some of the ways we're contextualizing results. I think I end on climate change. So these are the different emissions pathways that we're forecasting. The orange line here is this transformation world, the very positive world. The blue line here is the disarray world. The emissions that you're going to see from this disarray world are not going to get you to a global temperature change that's like an RCP 8.5. And when we start contextualizing this on long-term temperature change, here I've pulled out the global reasons for concerns from the IPCC report, sometimes called the burning embers graph, well-known graph in this space. And it's showing you the red line here is disarray, the green line here is transformation, and what our model suggests global temperature change would be in 2050. So still in disarray, short of a 3-degree transformation. And then in 2100, we see our uncertainty grow significantly. And the transformation world does get us to below a 1-degree change, well below 1.5. And then the worst case world is still shy of 4 degrees. So this suggests to me that some of the more extreme emissions scenario, RCP 8.5, for example, is not so plausible. I see a question in the chat from Ortwin about wars, homicide, natural disasters due to climate change. The forward effect of climate change isn't granular in a way that I would want, where you're looking at a really granular representation of climate change on natural disasters, though that literature is also mixed. Like it's clear with forests, it's less clear with extreme like ocean-based weather systems. So I have a mixed way of understanding it. The effect of climate change is general through damage functions that are very appropriately criticized. In terms of conflict, we do a lot to represent conflict. Our Civil War work, I think, is the most notable, and we made significant assumptions about increases in conflict in the disarray world. Though, as you will, I think there's a subtext to your question, like how accurately are we able to represent things that are based on societal tipping points and downstream effects, yada, yada. So I think that's where I'll end, and happy to talk at any point in this conversation space.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was very informative, really looking at the mechanics of your scenario building, and very interesting. Lots of questions that could be asked there. For example, I really would like to understand better how your scenarios for climate change or trajectories compared to the IPCC ones, because they seem to be a little different, and in light of some of the criticism of the IPCC underestimating the likely temperature increases, or being a little bit on the conservative side. I was just wondering what your views are on that, if I could just get a question off my chest.
No, yeah, of course, happy to talk about that. I think I'm of multiple minds, but if I were just to say most directly, I think that some of the RCP pathways, I think RCP 8.5 is way too high, and it's very hard to understand how we get there. But that's a scenario assumption that is a different kind of thing than the question of, are global models underestimating temperature change? The work I've seen, I'm not an expert on that, so let me just say this is what I've consumed in that space, shows that there are certainly discrepancies recently, like El Nino effects, that cause temperature fluctuations to not be really represented maybe as well as you'd like, but the long-term trend seems to still be quite good. So I'm of the mindset that it takes a lot of time to understand the degree to which these models might be underestimating climate change. And what I've seen on that validation space is that they're still pretty robust. But that may just be a thin understanding that doesn't reflect some things that you know that I don't.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And I think before we get into deeper discussion, we'll move on to Ajay, who will be speaking to us about the role of ASRA in the writing of the report. Ajay, if you would like to unmute yourself and you can share your screen.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Jonathan. Fascinating presentation. Great to be here. I hope you can all see my screen in presentation mode.
Yes.
Yep. Thomas is giving me a nod, which is great. So yeah, AJ Gambier, Director of Systemic Risk Assessment at ASRA, which is the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment. It's an independent non-profit, but it is hosted by the UN Foundation. So we have a connection to the UN, and I think I first learned about the development of the UN Global Risk Report when I was in New York a couple of years ago, and we were just discussing in the UN offices a report that we were writing which has ended up being called Facing Global Risks with Honest Hope. Uh, so that's the uh, background of when I first knew about this report. I'd like to just take a few minutes, probably no more than 5 to 10 minutes, to give you a quick overview of ASRA and a few reflections on the report. We didn't have great involvement in it, but just touched on it at a few different points in its development. So ASRA, we independently funded by philanthropy initially, hosted by the UN Foundation. We have this mission, as it says here, which is to accelerate transformative action that protects the Earth's ecological systems and humanity from the threats of escalating systemic risks. So very interested in all of this stuff. Thinking about systemic risk broadly, but certainly through its compounding and cascading implications all the way up to catastrophic risk or even X risk. We pursue our mission in 4 ways. So we galvanize a diverse transdisciplinary global network of risk practitioners. We have a network of about 90 members now. Very lucky to have some world-leading excellent members, including Ortwin, who is on this call, I can see, and they cover all sorts of areas across all sorts of sectors, disciplines, worldviews, genders, geographies, and generations. So we have a great variety of perspectives at our disposal. We're trying to catalyze the science and practice of systemic risk assessment. There are already some very good frameworks and tools out there. I think Jonathan was showing us a very interesting tool in that last presentation. We're trying to further see what we can add to the tools that are already out there to make them simple, to make them usable, to teach people systems thinking so that they're not just sticking to their disciplinary or sectoral silos. Third bullet down, we are looking to strengthen systemic risk response capacities. So even though we're called the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, we are very, very interested in how do we respond to escalating, amplifying systemic risks. So that's about highlighting opportunities for action and interventions at all scales, from the local to the global. And then finally, advocating for strategies, approaches, and perspectives. So that means engaging with all sorts of sectors, all sorts of communities, whether that's at the policy level, whether that's at the local or the multilateral level, whether that's finance institutions, whether that's food system scientists, health economists. Ultimately, systemic risk, because of its interconnections, encompasses everything at all scales, which is hugely challenging, a little bit intimidating, but it has to be thought about and it has to be done. So that is ASRA. And we had a couple of bits of engagement in the UN report. So talked to the Secretary General's office, and that was back in September 2023, and then were asked to think about the survey that they were designing. So at the end of 2023, we looked at the survey, which at the time looked very interesting. We offered a few bits of feedback. It's a really good risk perception survey, as I'll come on to, because it goes beyond just asking which are the risks that you're most concerned about in terms of likelihood and severity, but it actually starts to delve into these elements of systemic risk, which is what are the interconnections between key risks? And you'll see that in some of the systems maps that the report helpfully produces. And then our executive director, Ruth Richardson, was asked to provide some feedback on some early drafts of the report in the first half or so of last year. So, yeah, we had a little bit of an early sight of how the report was developing, and it's great to see it come to fruition a few months ago. So high-level reflections. As I said, the risk perception survey is extremely useful. I like the geographical disaggregation, very much as the World Economic Forum report does as well. I like the way in which it categorizes these 28 different risks that it explores into high level categories. So you can see economic, environmental, political, and so on, with that color coding there being extremely useful. I think the results arguably are quite unsurprising. We know what's top of people's minds. It's interesting seeing some regional variation. It's also interesting, just on my second bullet, how different people surveyed may have interpreted the same thing differently. So some people may have thought about geopolitical tensions being a severe risk. Other people may have thought about geopolitical tensions escalating into large-scale war. They may have been going to a very similar kind of place in terms of that, but they present as two different types of risks. But nevertheless, I really appreciated the granularity and level of detail that was gone into there. There's also a risk interconnection map, which is extremely useful. This is just a subsection of that map. It's formulated through the perception survey. So the strengths of connections and the directions of connections are derived from the survey. It's notable that there are particular things that we know would be interconnected in particular directions that maybe don't appear here. And that's not because the results are wrong. It's just that whenever you're doing a survey, you have limited time to take, the goodwill of people who are filling in these surveys, and you can't explore every interconnection. So, we know, for example, that looking at the red circle, the mass movement of people, which seems to be a node for lots of things leading into that risk, we know that that can also itself be a cause of so many other risks. So we know that the mass movement of people and migration will be a major cause of rising geopolitical tensions. And of course, one would expect through more detailed surveys and more time to get that arrow, therefore, pointing from mass movement to geopolitical tensions. I think one of the things I'm reflecting on is how do we explore this system mapping space more thoroughly? I think that might be through smaller groups of people in participatory workshops, and I would love to see those kinds of methods overlaid onto the large perception surveys that have already been done.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for bringing that up. I was going to ask actually about the risk interaction map because I had some concerns with it, and because as you say, it's very difficult for people to conceptualize these interactions. It is overwhelming. Let's just be honest here and just admit just how complicated it is and how hard to quantify, notwithstanding the best efforts of people like Jonathan and the Pardee Institute, who are really trying very hard to quantify, and that's very valuable, but it is extremely complicated. And when you're doing basically an opinion survey, a perception survey, you cannot quite expect people to think of everything. And for example, on the map, there's no perceived link between climate change and war, and yet we know that climate change can trigger conflict over resources such as water and food. I mean, we can expect quite a lot of conflict, for example, in Asia over water. So here, the most interconnected risk is seen to be global political tension. And I think it's a little bit also influenced by the current state of affairs in the world. So there's certain issues that are very present in people's minds at the moment, and others that are perhaps not so much covered in the news at the moment. And yeah, so it's perceptions probably shaped that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're all good points. And, I think certainly don't want to be one of those people that expects the Earth from a first sort of attempt of surveys like this. So I really appreciate, I think, some of the efforts at building those interconnections. But as you say, Thomas, perception surveys will be subject to biases and heuristics, availability bias, certainly. And we know that this report was released in 2025, but it's called the Global Risk Report 2024 because it reports on results from 2024. We know a lot's happened between 2024 and 2025, and would fully expect that those results that are in both of the charts on my screen might look very different in light of recent events that we've seen over the past months. But nevertheless, a good, useful first attempt at this. I really like the foresight scenarios. I'm a big fan of those. Like Jonathan, I know about integrated assessment modeling. I've run an integrated assessment modeling group at Imperial College before I came into my current position at ASRA, and I think that many of the models, even though they cover many variables, many sectors, still miss vital interconnections and nuances. And I like rich storylining approach that's contained in scenarios. So I think these are very useful indeed. You touched on, I think, and I think Altwin's question touched on how bad the scenarios could or might get. We have a breakdown scenario, but we don't have a genuine collapse or an existential risk scenario there. So there's always space to expand the scope, I think, which might usefully tell us what our resilience actions could or should be at the extreme ends. And of course, when you're building a limited set of scenario archetypes from a combinatorial explosion of variables, you're necessarily going to miss out some of the richness. And we know that reality will combine elements of all of these. So the key challenge is how do you draw potential responses and resilience measures from different elements of these scenarios? I think just to finish, slightly self-serving note, I started by talking about the Facing Global Risks with Honest Hope report that we published in the end, just on the eve of the UN Summit for the Future in September last year. So we published our report a year ago, and we came up with some different recommendations: multilateral governance and multi-scale governance, reflecting what's in the UN report, very much at the heart of that, but a role for everyone actually to think in a more systemic way and build what we call at the center of this systemic risk capacity. So that's across citizens, NGOs, and civil society. It's across doing research in a different and more transdisciplinary way. It's around corporations, finance, and regulatory organizations looking at the interlinkages between their actions and others. Similarly, for funders and data and evidence, making that data, making the data points open, as Jonathan was saying, they're trying to do is very, very central to this. So going forward, I think, great start. The risk perception is very valuable. Perhaps overlaying that with other data and evidence sources and seeing where the hotspots are and then building interconnections up that way would make it even richer. I'll stop there. Very happy to take any questions or go over anything in discussion. Thanks, Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much, Ajay. That's very helpful. And I'd just like to comment on your final slide there, and because one of the conclusions of the reports is that, and I quote from page 37, while stakeholders recognize the interconnectedness of risks, this understanding is not adequately reflected in current international institutions, which often address risks in silos. Um, and that's exactly also where the UN would like to then actually act on some of the findings of the report by setting up a task team to strengthen UN systems' capacity to address risk um, in this sort of integrated way. Um, so they want to also finalize standard operating procedures that strengthen UN anticipation of and response to complex global shocks. The issue of preparedness, not just prediction, but preparedness. But anyway, I think we'll leave it there for the moment, and I'm going to hand over to Mike Marion. Mike, if you would like to unmute. Mark is our research director, and Mark is the ultimate consumer of risk reports. He is largely responsible for compiling and curating uh, our directory of reports together with Lorenzo Rodriguez, who's also here tonight. And Michael has, because of his work, has a very strong comparative perspective on risk reporting, and would like to share some thoughts with us. Mike, over to you. If you please unmute, Mike. Uh, Mike, we can't hear you. Yeah, you're still muted. You're still muted, Mike. Tech support, can you unmute Mike, please?
Okay. Can you hear
All
me?
right, thank you.
Okay. Several weeks ago, or maybe it was a month or two ago, I came across the UN risk report. My initial reaction was very positive. I thought, hey, this might be a lodestar in the sense that something that a lot of people could get behind and share. But then on further reflection, I said, well, I'll take a look at the World Economic Forum annual risks report, which has virtually the same title, and see how it compares. And it's very, very interesting. And I want to just start with a couple minutes on both their similarities and their somewhat different results. The UN survey is more than 1,100 stakeholders in 136 countries, including representatives of, quote, government, industry, civil society, and academia. The World Economic Forum has a survey of more than 900 global leaders across academia, business, government, international, and civil society, plus 100 thematic experts, including risk specialists, essentially the same uh, uh, broad number of groups. The basic result is a UN ranking of 28 risks, the top three being climate change inaction, large-scale pollution, and misinformation, disinformation. The World Economic Forum ranked 32 risks. In the next 2 years, the top three being mis and disinformation, extreme weather, and state-backed armed conflict. There's more or less a rough correlation between the top 10 lists of the two surveys as the different terminology is used. The forecast, the UN said the next 1 to 7 years, the top three would be AI and frontier technology, a new pandemic, and cybersecurity. The World Economic Forum, they have in the next 10 years, the top three would be extreme weather, biodiversity, ecosystem collapse, and critical change to Earth's systems. The World Economic Forum, however, has an extensive analysis of both the 2025 risks as a world of growing divisions and the 2035 risks which they say the point of no return is quite different from the international futures scenarios. Both reports offer what I call a spaghetti chart of risk interactions. The UN report has a network map of global risks, is what they call, and the World Economic Forum has a global risk landscape with straight lines, which you can interpret as uncooked spaghetti. But essentially it's the same thing, showing potential interactions, and there's just all sorts of different ways in which I think they can be done. Analysis by group, the UN has the most important risks by location of respondent, top 10 risks in 7 geographic areas. The World Economic Forum has global risks ranked by 6 age groups and 5 stakeholder groups, which is the same approach to discriminating the types of risk, but different groups. The UN report has a lot of additional stuff that the World Economic Forum doesn't have. Very quickly, top 10 risks by connection strength and cascade risks, which risks are we least prepared for, critical global vulnerabilities, most effective actions to reduce risks, 13 barriers to better global risk management, which I think is a very good list of all the impediments that are going on to achieving any meaningful transformation. And of course, there are 4 scenarios, what alternatives futures lie ahead. They also have 3 annexes, and they just say annexes, but they should have mentioned the first one, especially on risk definitions, is fairly interesting. The World Economic Forum, however, has a very interesting section way back towards the end of its 100-page report in Appendix D on risk governance, where they show the top risks that can be addressed by R&D, national and local entities, development assistance, financial instruments, corporate strategies, and multi-stakeholder engagement. And also they have another chart that's disconnected from those of the top risks that can be addressed by treaties and agreements. The bottom line of that is that there's an awful lot of groupings and individuals that can play some sort of role in dealing with an awful lot of risks. So what is the significance of the UN report? Well, it depends on the definition of the significance and the readers of the report. And I suggest that you send a questionnaire to the 1,100 stakeholders and ask, well, have you read all or part of the report? What features add to your understanding? What new policies or actions are suggested to you? And what actions have been taken, if any, as a result of reading this report? Now, that's a useful question, but a better question would be what changes could be made for the next to make the next report even more significant by whatever definition you want. Well, I think the stakeholders should certainly suggest a lot of adds and deletes, and you should pay attention to that. My suggestion is that I think it's important to mention the overlaps with the World Economic Report, which is now in its 20th annual edition. And I simply politely assume that these overlaps are coincidental, but they do raise questions. So I think if you deal with them up front and mention that there is some overlap, then you'll be covering yourself. Also, I think that the UN report would benefit by mentioning relevant recent reports from other UN agencies, especially UNDP and the UN Environmental Program, which has excellent reports. The UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction and several other agencies. So that's the better question on the next report. But the biggest question of all, well, what is needed most in risk reporting? And at this point, I would introduce a very brief discussion of what we are doing on EXTRA and how EXTRA is quite different from these 2 risk reports. The EXTRA InfoHub surveys selected literature, mostly reports, which are neglected, but some books and journal articles, and categorizes it into 5 major categories: overviews, such as the risk reports, planet, people, security, and sustainability, and some 33 keywords under these categories. The directory has about some 200 annotated items so far that it's assembled so that users can easily access important recent thinking on topics such as climate, migration, biodiversity, pollution, oceans, AI, finance, etc., etc., etc. Now, the InfoHub, the Extra InfoHub, is not better or worse than the risk reports, but it's just different. That's all, and enables a list of 10 key ideas about Extra, top 20 recent reports, which both of these overviews are on the website, and a bottom line middle column forecast, which I say is neither panicky or poo-poo, that extinction of all or a significant portion of humanity, the broader definition of extinction is important, is neither impossible or certain, but it's certainly possible in the next decade or so, and probable if key transitions aren't realized in the next few decades. Now, in looking at Extra, I think there are three important lessons to be learned from that. First, fragmentation, complexity, and uncertainty. Fragmentation is obvious if you look at the entries in the directory, and as well the list of 80 organizations that have made some contribution, all seemingly without contact without each other. So overall, I think there are four major gaps that ought to be addressed, in addition to the fragmentation between organizations and individuals. First, between the descriptive generalists who are concerned with risk reports and other overviews, and the general normative schemes, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and human security for all, which is what the World Academy is promoting. A second major gap is between these generalists and those concerned with single areas such as nuclear weapons, climate, public health, pandemics, and artificial intelligence and superintelligence, which are all quite different from each other and demanding quite very different actions. Thirdly, it gets more difficult here is between what I would call the cosmopolitan, progressive, scientific thinkers, actors, and politicians on the left. That's us. I think we all agree on that in a broad, holistic view. And the growing right-wing nationalist populist groups, such as Alternative for Germany, and notably the Trump 2.0 regime, which is based on Project 2025. And there's no easy answers in overcoming this political polarization that is going on right now. Finally, and this is a major puzzlement for me, there's this gap between the world of the United Nations and related thinking on growing risks, which we're discussing here, and the major media, such as New York Times, The Economist, even the left-wing Guardian, etc., along with major talk shows in the US at least, none of which have the slightest hint of growing risk or polycrisis. What is going on here? I mean, is it a failure of outreach from the UN and the people who compose its reports, or is it a failure of the reporters? But there's something that needs to be dealt with here. I'm deeply puzzled by this, and why the New York Times, for example, has no mention of sustainability in the SDGs. Wouldn't it be nice if they had a sustainability section every once a week? So, I have an answer to the biggest question. This is a very rough draft, but just to be provocative, that we need more detailed reports and journal articles are useful, but they're not really what is needed most. Rather, we need some sort of lodestar type of report that can be widely shared, with frequent spin-offs, op-ed articles, and talk show interviews stressing the growing list of serious threats and risks and the widening poly crisis. I think Ajay Gamber says escalating poly crisis. Believe this is true. So a tentative title for this effort might be the Super Woke Project, with the subtitle of We're Woke, damn it, and you should be too. It would require some modest funding to support a couple dozen leaders who, in various related ways, could take on Donald's dimwits and clearly explain why the MAGA mega hoax of America First is hurting America and the world in many ways. Illustrative of this gap between left and right thinking on threats is the comparison which I urge of the annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence agencies prepared under the Biden administration in 2024 and the severely truncated 2025 assessment under the Tulsi Gabbard and the Trump administration. Check out the difference of how they narrowed their focus on threats in the Trump administration to drugs and the usual and a few of the usual suspects in that. Finally, I would like to cite a notable comment concluding the remarkable six-part Netflix documentary Life on Our Planet. A mere 10 minutes of the final episode was devoted to current global trends on population, urbanization, climate pollution, etc. Moderator Morgan Freeman noted that these trends may lead to extinction, but, he said, ours is the first species to know what is happening and could do something about it. Well, this is profoundly true, and it's also profoundly misleading because there are hundreds of explanations as to what is happening globally and nationally. A lodestar document could help to overcome this basic fragmentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Certainly very provocative statements there. You've pointed at some of the elephants in the room, the politics that is happening right now, that is threatening the very multilateral system we'd like to see strengthened. And clearly that is a risk multiplier. And some of my own research as an anthropologist has been on culture change, social change over many decades. I've studied social change and also change resistance, first in relation to climate change. And it's very difficult for people to understand and accept that their whole way of life needs to change. People like the devil they know, and if you ask them to change their worldview and their daily lives, it's like you're threatening their existence. And it's not surprising then that there's a lot of reactionary responses, and there are unscrupulous politicians who everywhere around the world, whether it is in my native Germany, here in Australia, certainly in the US, they're managing to get people's resentments and fears weaponized for political purposes. So that is a big problem for the multilateral system. We see this resurgent nationalism. I mentioned it very briefly before. But I'd like to, we need to come back to this discussion at the end. And also what you said about, the comparative perspective on existential risk reporting. Like you said, there's so many organizations active in this space. We would like to look at some of these in turn. We'd like to have a session on the World Economic Forum report. We'd also like to have a session on polycrisis, which you mentioned. Actually, Ortwin is organizing that for us. Ortwin is a member of our team, Ortwin Wen, and in early November, we're going to have a special focus session on polycrisis. But now I would like to really, I'm excited to introduce to you Stephen Hartman. Stephen and I have been collaborating for many years. I was actually the vice representative during some of the discussions in Paris at UNESCO on the foundation of bridges. which Stephen is a director of. And Bridges is an important different perspective. So it's an alliance that looks at some of these challenges, especially environmental threats, but also social. The keyword is sustainability, but it's also social sustainability. So it's the spectrum of all the factors that make our current way of life unsustainable and put it at risk. So it's really just a slightly different language, but it's about the same thing. And the unique thing about Bridges is that it brings the perspective of the humanities and social sciences into the picture. And it gets onto those issues like Mike was talking about, the politics, the change resistance, and so on. So over to you, Stephen, and I'm very excited to hear your perspective. And by all means, say a little bit more about Bridges, if you like.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
You can. Okay,
Fine.
good. Excellent. Thanks very much for inviting me along. This was fascinating to read up for, and it's been fascinating to hear about what has gone into the production of the report and the data collection. I'm neither an expert on modeling nor in some of the sort of methodologies that came into play in the production of this report. So I'm rather coming out of the social sciences and the humanities originally. Bridges, by the way, is I guess it's a bit interesting in the UN context because we have one foot within UNESCO and operationally several feet outside of UNESCO. So our operational capacity, our implementation capacity, and the different programs that we pursue, including everything from larger scale research projects to community cooperations, to actually engagement in the science policy process, is something that is funded outside of UNESCO, but our governance is nested within UNESCO, and we have a sort of a statutory role within the Management of Social Transformations program. So I don't know of another program like ours that has that sort of dual footing, with both within a UN organization and outside of it. And I've often thought that that's a strength with us. It makes us maybe more agile. But nevertheless, when I began thinking about the different findings of this report, and my mind kept turning back to the respondents and wishing to know in a bit more detail about the nature of the respondents. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking here. I think that in the chat window, Ortwin asks, he said, Ajay, you were skeptical about using perception survey as a base for the study, but what is the alternative, he asked. And is there an objective way to prioritize systemic risks? And for me, this immediately raises the question of the representativity of the respondents and the relative balance demographically, sectorally, and so forth of the respondents in terms of the kinds of biases, heuristics, availability of respondents that, Ajay, that you referred to as coming into play and potentially, affecting the data that everything's been building upon. And so I suppose I have more questions than I have, I feel, informed viewpoints on the findings of the report, that I would love to hear a little bit more about some of these things, because even though in the second annex there is a breakdown of the different stakeholders, communities that were addressed, what I don't have a clear sense of is what the relative sort of distribution of those was. And for me then, the first question that was raised for me when I read the document was, why wasn't it called Perceptions of Global Risk? And I suppose then for me, the assumption that I had was that it may be because this is based wholly on respondents who are themselves experts. But I don't know that to be the case. And then in that case, what is the relative balance among civil society, UN organizations, academics, academic community, and so forth? So I'd actually, if you don't mind, like to sort of begin by throwing that question out and asking if anybody would like to take a bite, because I would find it very useful in terms of thinking about the parameters of some of the scenarios that are addressed in the report. If I had a clearer sense of some of these ideas. So Ajay, I already raised your name.
All means, Stephen, yeah, we can come back to you in a minute. But yeah, Ajay and Jonathan, if you'd like to comment on that question. In a nutshell, again, Stephen, it's about the
Hello?
because I suppose it's a fairly elite group too, who are so that it's an expert view. Is that correct? Am I correct to say that?
Thomas, just at the beginning of summarizing Stephen's question, but I think you were saying what was the makeup and the kind of demographic of the respondents. I don't know actually. I know that there was a lot of effort put into trying to send it out to a diverse group of people, but I fully agree that the risk perception surveys that we're most used to seeing do tend to be quite biased to professionals in particular job roles, and there's a lot of very important work that needs to be done by comparing risk perception surveys across a variety of different demographic groups and target stakeholder groups. So yeah, I don't know the full range of this. I don't know if Jonathan or others know what the makeup was, but yeah, it's certainly something where we will probably find very, very different responses from very, very different groups of people, age groups, gender, location in the world, sector, and so on.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. The people who were in charge of the survey process and the assessment of the results were a survey group at the National University in Singapore. So those would be people you could reach out to if you were truly deeply curious about this. But I'm not, I would consider it a survey of elites for sure. And I don't know the distribution.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Do you want me to continue with a couple of comments or questions,
Yes,
Thomas?
Stephen, there's also a comment in the chat by Anne Snick, dear colleague of ours, and she says, in my experience, young people are less resistant to change than older generations. Education, therefore, should no longer be narrowed down to passing on knowledge from older generations to the next, but should be broadened to include imagining different pathways towards the lodestar that Mike mentioned. Pathways to sustainability, to risk mitigation. In other words, research on this new pedagogical paradigm shows this can be done, and under what conditions it could scale. And this is really UNESCO is in the UNESCO's main area of concern, education, of course. So, Stephen, can you educate people for being aware of risk and being aware of the need for a shift to a transformation to sustainability? What's your view there?
Yeah, so I think for me that's a really crucial question. I mean, I think that this report is really valuable in a number of ways, and I think the extent to which it can be built upon and with what sort of on one hand, applicability, wider applicability, I think, depends, for me at least, on having a clearer sense of some of these things. I think that, among other things, if it truly is a global sort of report on risk perception, it's valuable just insofar as seeing how certain maybe sectoral biases seem to be reinforced in the report. I'll give you one example. If you think about the risk connections diagram and the risk connections that can inform global action on page 11 and 10 and 11. That was a very sort of fascinating page in its own right. And when we look at climate change in action and its relations to large-scale pollution, biodiversity, natural resource shortage, natural hazard risks, and so forth, immediately what we do is we see climate change in action having effects as it's represented in that diagram on mass movement of people, and I would imagine others that aren't necessarily elaborated in this particular, but I think some of the findings seem to suggest that this is dynamic, and we kind of begin with climate change in action, but without necessarily troubling why that inaction exists and what's influencing that. And I think that many of the other categories about misinformation, disinformation, and some that may be implicit in sort of tech-driven power concentration, corporate influence on political agendas and priorities and policy priorities and so forth. I think we can say right now, just by looking around the world right now with what's happening in many parts of the world, but certainly let's just say the United States as an example, the renouncing or denouncing of the UN's SDGs and the embracing of fossil fuels going against scientific consensus about the need actually to keep fossil fuels in the ground and be turning over increasingly to renewable energy sources, sort of gives us a pretty good idea already there, gives us a pretty good indication the extent to which, in this case, the fossil fuel industry is having an enormous effect on the policy agendas, and that is having an enormous effect on international relations between the United States and other countries. And that is having enormous effects on scientific agendas, including suppression of scientific agendas and the validity of science and data suppression and all of these things and so what I wonder about is to the extent to which the report either already takes into consideration or could open itself up into wider dynamic feedback loops across categories or clusters. Because I think the reality of the situation is, and this is within the Bridges Coalition, we take this as a given, that the climate change is not primarily an environmental crisis. It's a socio-environmental crisis, and very strongly a political and an economic crisis in terms of the economic actors and the centers of power increasing towards greater accumulation of wealth and oligarchic interest, outsized sort of influence of a smaller and smaller number of people affecting national agendas, and really running interference on the kind of policies that need to be embraced, including the greater collaboration between governmental, intergovernmental, civil society, and other sectors that the report seems to suggest already is acknowledged as being the most sort of forward-looking or positive direction that we could be taking things in. But there's a great deal of effort to obstruct that very kind of thing. So this is a bit long-winded, I'm sorry about that, but these were the thoughts that were, when I was looking at the principal findings that opened up for me, and it made me question to what extent there was room for nuancing further, maybe the methodologies that came in a subsequent report. And it's messy. I agree. I realize it's messy. And when you're dealing with sort of archetype scenarios, four archetype scenarios, I understand that you can't include everything and so forth. But for me, then it raises that question. I want to pull at that thread. Okay, how well does the international community, even the professional international community, already understand the extent to which this messiness is sort of contributing to a negative development, and how much and if that's the case, how much do we need to sort of educate more ourselves and those under our charges in educational institutions and so forth, on some of those things that are sort of contributing to, and so climate change in action, we could see in this report as kind of a cause, but itself it's an effect of a very complex number of other causes. So anyway, I'll step back from there, and these are the questions that this report raised for me.
Yes, I think that's very important. And our chat is heating up because these are interesting questions. And I think my own view is that the UN report actually is quite good because it's about perceptions. It's actually quite open to the social political side of things. But as Anne said, it has a tendency to look at the risk amplifiers, the concerns. That was the brief. And it's a little dangerous to look only at the risks and the risk amplifiers, and not also somewhat map in the factors that might mitigate risks, such as good education, educating people to have an open mind about change, to understand change as a positive thing, mobilizing young people, and perhaps also preventing them from becoming the victim of a populist propaganda that is reactionary in nature and plays on fear and give people hope. So some of the mitigating factors need to be thought about almost at the same time, and I think I'm thinking of the SDGs, and in a way, the report needs to be looked at together with the SDGs, was my feeling. And certainly when we developed our map of existential risks, we were also thinking of the SDGs, because in a way that's the sort of the positive strategic approach to change. Let's say it's sort of saying, let's shape the future, let's make it desirable for everyone and take everyone along, and not exclude anyone, alleviate poverty, and so on, food security, and all these sort of basic concerns that also speak to a lot of people. So we need to stress also the elements that might give some hope. There's one comment from Ortman I'd like to read out. It's a question: what is the take of all participants that the scientific communities are, as well as the major stakeholders, are clear about the need for transformations and corporations? Yet 2/3 of the population is ruled by leaders who deny these needs and ignore facts. Many of these leaders have been successful in getting the majority of votes. What is going wrong here? And what do we do wrong that we have? Why is it that we have so little impact on governments? So we're here, a little bit like a voice in the wilderness, warning everyone of the risks that we face. And it seems that the political establishment doesn't respond enough, especially at the level of international cooperation at the moment. What can we do differently? How can we maybe come to that lodestar that Mike is speaking about? Clearly, I mean, within EXTRA, it is our aim to bring these discussions together to kind of be like a bit of a lens to focus that energy and make a difference, and also to discuss our concerns, our own worries in this community, and the sort of obstacles that we face. If anyone would like to come in on that issue. For example, I mean, Jonathan, the Pardee Institute is very much on the, quite heavy on science and data analysis. How do you see your future in this environment now? Is it what are the pressures? I mean, we hear all this news about the EPA and NOAA being gutted and so on. What is the mood in the community in the US?
Oh, it's not good. It's not very good. There's a lot of disruption and there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and that affects funding and resources and makes it hard to invest. It makes it hard to be strategic. And so those are all real challenges that we face. There's also, I think it's interesting, mis and disinformation are such a widely perceived risk across these kind of elite survey groups. Like, I think it makes a lot of sense, but it also makes it harder to simply convince people that a risk is a risk and science matters and those kinds of things. So I think we have to completely revisit how we've been thinking about communicating these ideas and I mean, from my vantage point, I think this isn't a critique of the risk community in any particular way, but I think that there are a lot of lessons we can draw from how climate change research was communicated and is communicated. If you look at how I think there was a comment by Anne about paralyzing effect of the existential risk side of it, and I think there are a lot of scientists who get in these global assessment spaces and decide that they may have a hard science background, but they're also becoming an expert on how to communicate to the public on these things, and those skills are
Mm.
different. Scaring people endlessly doesn't
Yeah.
really work. And so I think the scientific community lost a lot of credibility with the
Mm.
public, how it
Yes.
communicate these issues. And so how do you go from that approach to an approach that says our job is to tell you what we know and to tell you what we don't know as well?
Mm.
And how do you do that when you're thinking about the future? Because
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
has never happened, it's always the present. So how do we think about a space that's fundamentally characterized by uncertainty? And how do we talk about things in honest ways where we're not, when we ourselves know that there are limits to how we understand these things. There will always be limits because the future will always be uncertain. It will always be
Mm.
an open system that we can only cut into in narrow ways that are limited. So
Mm.
I think that's really messy. But I think we
Yes,
should
I think
just
that's
a final
that's
point. I think that what we should be doing is talking about more and less durable trends, more and less durable understandings of things, and contextualize our knowledge in that way. The future is not unknowable. The future has a lot of durability built into it. And so how do we have that conversation? That's my
mm.
perspective.
Yes, I think that's a very, very important point about science communication. I mean, the very concept of risk, if you think about it in a way, of course, one response is cowardice, to be afraid, to go into denial, uh, to try and pretend it doesn't exist, hoping it will go away. Another response is courage, to say, well, risk is fine. Every day that when we get into a car and take a drive, we're taking serious risks, and yet they're manageable. We are at the steering wheel. We have our foot on the brake or the accelerator as needed. We have some control of how we deal with risk. Life is a matter of dealing with risks in every moment. So in a way, we have to communicate that risk is quite a normal thing, quite a natural thing, a part of life, and it's about how we deal with it. And our job is to help people deal with it, understand it better, and uh, quantify it and respond to it, and put humanity in the driver's seat when it comes to shaping the future, not let it happen to us, but take the steering wheel into our hands. That, I think, is the message. That's, for me, the lodestar. Lorenzo, Lorenzo is the editor of our newsletter. If you would like to make a comment, Lorenzo, most welcome.
Thank you very much. I would like to just make a small contribution regarding Ortwin's question about where are we going wrong on this and communicating to policymakers, but also to regular people, regular citizens about the importance of existential threats. And I will dare to say that the COVID crisis, they did incredible damage to the reputation of scientific institutions and evidence-based institutions, because there was a lot of back and forth between the political class that was just ideologically motivated to go against the evidence, and then the people that was supporting the fact that, hey, there's a pandemic and we have been advising for a long time and warning that this is going to happen because we are not taking the measures needed to do it. And this connects immediately with the fact that pandemics is part of the whole setup of existential threats. They are going to be there. And just as Jonathan was saying, the future is impossible to know. We don't know the entirety of the outcomes and on which timeline we're going to be, but we can create the scenarios and make fair assumptions of where are we going to end up if we don't change course. That's why probability exists as an entire field of mathematics, we can create probabilities about how things are going to unfold. And I think that the whole COVID pandemic, among the whole misinformation, disinformation, fake news, current crossroads that we have, and the polarization regarding ideological spectrums, are making a huge damage to the reputation of the scientific community, regardless if you are in natural sciences or social sciences. The thing is that people tend to just not believe us anymore. They just don't take us enough. They are not taking us seriously enough anymore. And that's problematic because it's not that we, as part of this community, we want to take a step and think that we are superior to them. That's not the case. We're just trying to warn about the things that everyone in this community is doing and the findings that are. But just like Jonathan was saying, we need to find better ways to communicate it. We are failing on that. One of the most troublesome things about the discourse that goes against science and against evidence and against everything that is happening, the climate change negationist and so on, is that it's easy to externalize the guilt. Because it's simple. It's simple to say that it's someone else is responsible, and there was a Spaniard politician saying something very interesting the other day. That was why there's this trend of indigenous politics right now. He was saying, well, because everyone wants to love their country, and it's easy to say to someone that if you vote for me, it's an act of love towards your country because you're being faithful to your values and you're a patriot itself. But it's very difficult to explain to people that you are voting against your interest and that you're going to end up without a house, because the policies that these candidate is supporting are going against your interest because it's supporting the ruling class, or it's supporting the elites, or it's supporting the business class. So it's difficult to tell people, hey, the country, it's an abstract creation. The nation is an abstract creation. The reality of the matter is that if we continue acting as we are acting, you that are living in Florida, you're going to disappear because Florida is going to be swallowed by the sea. So it's difficult to tell people, not now, but in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years, you are gone, because the now, the present is too immediate. And that's something that I believe, and it's a very, very right on point, right on the money, where she was saying that young people are a bit more flexible in that regard. Yeah, we my generation is concerned about climate change when maybe the previous generation was not really concerned about it. So maybe Generation C and the generations of the future are going to be concerned about existential threats in a way that the current generation is not. So it's difficult to know what is going to unfold, but the scientific community needs to make a huge effort to connect with people. It's just a matter of that at the end of the day. And that's why I believe that Extra and all these different organizations are very important, such as ASRA. We're trying to communicate this speech to others, to people that is not knowledgeable, but to make it digestible and easy to understand.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenzo. Some very important points. It's very true. It's not just fear; it's also guilt. You know, people feel they know deep down that with their lifestyles, we all, I mean, all of us here as well, are contributing to climate change. We are contributing to pollution with our consumption choices, and so on and so forth. So there's also guilt involved, and the promise of alleviation of guilt is quite tempting, you know, to people, and that's another thing, you know. Instead of making people feel guilty, we have to give them choices, ideas of how they as individuals can also make meaningful contributions that add up and really make a huge difference. Ajay has his hand up. We're nearing the 90-minute mark. We don't have a hard limit on time, but I think it's probably should come to a close slowly. So perhaps if everyone could just make a quick concluding remark, and starting with Ajay.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I'll be brief. I think the extent to which people are not responding to scientific evidence and advice on climate change, particularly in light of the fact that we are seeing demonstrable damages from extreme weather events and quite solid statistical evidence about the relationship between that extreme weather and underlying warming, is surprising. So I think that we're dealing with complex systems here, and a key behavior of complex systems is emergence. I don't think this was necessarily reducible and predictable based on some model of individual or societal rationality. So I think we do need to be quite reflective and humble about how much we know about individual and societal responses to information and different ways of packaging messages up. I think there's a lot of experimentation that still needs to be done, because this is as Altwin's question, I think, hinted at, very difficult area. And I think many of us are surprised, disappointed, flabbergasted, and so on, that there is a growing body of evidence, but that the response to that perhaps is going in the opposite direction to what a rational scientist or rational person might expect. So I just finished there really by calling for perhaps more experimentation, more understanding of what's going on, because I don't think we fully do understand it yet. But thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And Jonathan, would you like to say a few words in closing?
I think this is a really important conversation that not enough people are having. And so I'm encouraged by all of these comments and the work that you all are doing. So thank you for that invitation. And yes, these are complex systems. Yes, they are adaptive in ways. And I think that we often lean one way or the other in that space and see the adaptation, and then in other cases see the vulnerability, and it's both. And understanding the relationship between those is a real puzzle, let alone the communication. So good luck to us all.
Okay. First of all, I think it's important that we speak to each other and exchange ideas and strategies, and talk about the challenges we face and, all the organizations that operate in this space. Uh, Stephen, did you want to say a few words to close? You still
Yeah, I'll just I
Okay.
can just maybe pick up on one thread. I agree with what we've heard, that these what we've heard so far over the last hour and a half, I think, opens up a number of interesting questions that certainly deserve to be followed up on. And the question, for instance, of the problem that science is having, the confidence in science in terms of the general that's a really critical question at the moment. And I think that there seems to be general agreement that more emphasis needs to be placed on communication, modes of communication, and maybe developing communication capacities. I think it might have been you, Ajay, who said that, some of the scientists that we rely on, for instance, to be contributing to the IPCC's assessment reports, which are, after all, scientific assessments. They don't dictate policy, but they're intended to inform policy. And in fact, they're supposed to stop short of making recommendations, but assessing what the science tells us about these issues. That mandate and that mission isn't necessarily consistent with what is then the political use of those assessments. And therefore, to rely on the same scientists to be experts in communication, addressing perhaps what is a political need that goes beyond their mandate as scientists, isn't fair to them and isn't fair to everybody else. So one of the things that occurs to me is that if it were possible to have meaningful conversations with UNFCCC and the IPCC about other categories of assessment that can come into play, having to do with the cognitive and other dimensions of messaging and so forth. I think these are meaningful things that could also benefit from scientific knowledge, but that don't really fall within the parameters of the assessment reports, let's say, for climate change right now. And so thinking about that kind of possible renewal that's a worthy exercise, I think. And to the extent that it might be possible then to have meaningful conversations that could affect future assessments, that allow some of these dimensions to be coming into the discussion as well. We have an entire social set of phenomena that have to be accounted for as well. And they're playing a meaningful role between what the science is telling us, how that's being synthesized and reported on and evaluated and assessed, and the political use of that information later on. And I don't think that we've got the mechanisms and that we need to and I think that the breakdown between credible science and popular understanding shows us that we don't have those. And so I think more that's a conversation that maybe needs to be amplified and made more urgent. So I'll stop there, but I want to thank everybody for a really very good conversation today. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me.
Stephen. Those are very important points, and I think it just brings me back to what our mission is in EXTRA, is to overcome some of those silos, to get communication happening between, say, the scientific community working on climate change, and those who take an interest in AI and the risks associated with that and the interactions. You cannot expect any one person to understand this in full depth, and all of these different risk areas. I mean, we try to be generalists. That's our brief, but we cannot be experts in every area. Personally, I work on food security. I've been working for many years on that. I can go into real detail, but I can't have that kind of command of detail in every area. It's impossible. So we have to bring people together. It's a joint project. It's a collaborative work to deal with existential risks, and that's what we're all about. Mark, did you want to say anything in closing?
No comment. I'm mulling over Ortwin's long comment about the scientific communities our major care about transformations, and yet the population is ruled by leaders who deny these needs. It's just you don't understand politics, that's all, and money. And I will deal with it in an email, but that's also what I was trying to get at in my very final comments about this gap between what we are talking about and what we see in the newspapers and the talk shows. There's something wrong on both ends. Or as Lorenzo says, we need to find better ways to communicate. But that's a huge question. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
That's a webinar itself.
Sorry?
That's a webinar itself. We can later on have a follow-up webinar about how to communicate better.
Okay, well, we've made a start, I think, by talking about the role of the UN. And I must say, just want to emphasize that we are quite glad to see the UN enter into this field and make itself heard on existential risks. I hope it's tied with action and that the connections are made to the SDGs in light of Anne's comment about solutions and need for hope. And I think we had very good presentations from Jonathan and Ajay to help us to understand how the report came to be. And the next one, I think there should be, it says that at the end that there will be a follow-up report by December 2026. I hope you again be involved, but we'll see. And I hope also that this discussion maybe helps a little bit in giving some feedback on the report. And it's the first, and it's a little bit harsh to compare it with the World Economic Forum report, for example, which it's been running for many years and has had time to become more refined. And I'm sure the UN Global Risk Report will improve and expand, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. I thank everyone for their contribution. It's been a very lively discussion, not your ordinary webinar. We've been quite conversational, and I've very much enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone in the audience for their comments and for being here. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, Thomas. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.